If you watch my weekly vlogs, you'll know that planning the Canadian Rockies trip was a bit complicated. This video will give you some insights on how to plan a Canadian Rockies trip. Before we get started, if you're interested in more videos about my adventures across reading, watching, playing and travelling, certainly like this video and subscribe. You can also post a comment because the comments are the lifeblood of this channel. In many ways, the Canadian Rockies trip was a big idea. With the whole Nature's Theme Park video thing going on post-separation from my wife, I really wanted to go. The challenge was, all my previous holidays had been of two types. Florida, obviously, primarily staying on Disney World property. Other locations in Europe and the US, but again, mostly located in one physical place. The same hotel. I didn't even switch up hotels halfway through the holiday. I was always located in one spot. The holidays may well have been constructed independently by myself, but it's quite easy to book a flight and one hotel, right? That can be the case with the Canadian Rockies holiday. You could organise it like that, but it's very unlikely, which makes it more challenging. You do have an option to pick a package when you go on a Canadian Rockies holiday. They involve time in the Rockies, possible combinations with things like the Rocky Mountaineer train. They may even include options to do an Alaskan cruise. Then they obviously factor in time in Vancouver. There are some really nice packages, and actually I came close to booking one which was quite effectively priced. It involved time in the Rockies, it involved the Rocky Mountaineer train and a cruise to Alaska. And for the price it was, I thought it was really effective. And I did nearly hit the button. Primarily because I really do want to do that Rocky Mountaineer train. The Alaskan cruise was really just a wonderful add-on. I have a life goal to one day do that Rocky Mountaineer train. Ultimately, I did go bespoke. I went bespoke because I didn't think the Rocky Mountaineer train and the Alaskan cruise were really the right thing for our first trip, but also primarily it then dictated how long we would spend in the Rockies. And a lot of the features of these packaged holidays is you just seem to spend slightly too short a time in certain places for favour of visiting some places you're not really that interested in. So that's largely why we ended up going bespoke. There are challenges to booking independently. And those challenges are challenges of discovery and also the popularity of the place. So I'll give you the biggest example. Don't think you're going to be able to go to Expedia like you can when you book a lot of other holidays and just book your accommodation. There are accommodations in places like Banff and Jasper, which are the two main areas, on Expedia, but let's get this straight. There isn't really many chain hotels in either of these locations, so they're all boutique, privately owned, and even have places like room shares in people's private homes. So you have to find different mechanisms to book your hotels. Also, since things run out fast, it creates a bit more complexity around the flight or hotel first dynamic. And you will have to really rely on the fact that most of the hotels, as you would imagine, are book now but only pay when you arrive. And you will probably maybe have to do a couple of book things within a certain flight range, possibly face tweaking them a bit or cancelling. It's a bit of a catch-22. I was lucky. I was able to look at the flights, look at the hotels, lock down the hotels, go back and get the flights just. I thought for about 48 hours that I'd lost the flights because of course I just had them in my mind. I couldn't book anything, and that I was going to have to do a non-direct flight home. But the flight did appear again, and luckily I could book it. But yeah, booking the accommodation is challenging due to availability going fast and the fact that you have to look at quite unique websites to find the accommodation. I will post the websites I use to find my accommodation in the description to this video, because you're going to have to use those. There is no way you could conveniently book the best Canadian Rockies holiday, and I'm not saying I've done that. I've made certain compromises to keep it simple, which we'll get to later in the video, but you'll certainly need those websites. In many ways, the Canadian Rockies reminds me of the lakes. As you'd imagine, that makes perfect sense. And one of the problems with the lakes is, you know there's 1,001 things to do, but you sort of can't find information on exactly how you do it. With the Canadian Rockies, that information is made more presentable to you, but you do have to dig for it a bit more than you would, say, with a Disney World holiday, where obviously you go there and everything's put on a plate, essentially. But there is ways to do it. So we'll get into what we're planning to do in a future video, but the way I found things I wanted to do, walks, trips, excursions, things like that, is I searched blogs. I looked for actually people's blog posts who'd went. You know, the whole 10 things to do in the Rockies, 10 things to do in Banff, 10 things to do in Jasper. They are amazingly useful. They're amazingly useful, especially for your first trip, when you're really probably not treading the routes not travelled by others. So that is well worth doing. Look at TripAdvisor, because it also has those top 10 things sort of articles, but key on TripAdvisor is it links through to excursions you can book with third parties. Now the key is, if you've got a car, which I would heartily recommend, the key thing is not to then book those excursions, but use them examples of what you can do. Because those excursions aren't really doing anything special, they're just taking you to locations and doing things that you could actually just do by driving up there and independently doing it. So that is a good way to discover the sort of things people like doing and then just doing it yourself. I would also recommend doing something completely old school. Get yourself a Lonely Planet book. Now I recommend that because it was completely and amazingly helpful to me. And the reason it was helpful, even though I've not got a Lonely Planet book for a holiday for absolutely years due to the facility known as the internet, is it puts everything in a consolidated place and contextualizes everything together. When you look stuff up on the internet, it is often information divorced from the context of everything else. What the Lonely Planet book does is, yes, I want to do X, but I now realize it's only so many miles away from Y. I can possibly fit them both in a day, and so on and so on and so on. It was only really through the Lonely Planet guide that I really discovered how much of a focus driving the Icefield Parkway was twice, because it put the Icefield Parkway in context of Jasper and Banff and how things relate. It's amazing for context, which then helps you do your internet searching, because it's not just bytes of information cut off from everything else. So get a Lonely Planet guide for a trip to the Canadian Rockies. I know it sounds old school, but it's really worth it. So, how to approach it? First, pick broadly where you want to go and consider simplifying it unless you're going on a package, which then decides those things for you anyway, so it's a moot point. Put a bit of thought into the sort of things you want to do. For example, we know that our first trip is focused on hitting as many lakes as possible and going on walks that aren't extreme, the simple to medium ones of around 4 to 6 miles or less that maximize view potential. There is more extreme walks, there is multi-day walks, which all sound absolutely fantastic, but we're being realistic on our first trip. So what will the focus be of your trip? Then look at the flights on Skyscanner and find the periods of time that are cheaper. Don't book anything. Don't book anything because you have no idea how well the accommodation journey is going to go. But you need to have in mind date ranges and flight dates that are amenable to the cost profile you're wanting to pay. Because there's no point looking for accommodation independent of flight costs only to find out you're hit with £800 flights or something and it ain't going to happen. Then the accommodation search begins. As I've said, I've put some websites in the description of this video which are where most of the accommodation sits. It is not on the websites you're used to. It's all privately owned, bespoke sort of hotels which do not need to advertise much because they fill up anyway. Finally, even though I managed to book my accommodation and I'm quite happy with what I have, if you're going in the summer months especially, book your accommodation early. This is not really a last minute sort of trip. In my experience, I may be wrong, there may be more experienced people who know how to do that and make it work, but my experience was things were going fast. And I'm going in September, which is sort of like, you know, one of those months either side of the summer. So consider booking your Canadian Rockies trip quite early. So in conclusion, the primary challenge, like a lot of these epic countryside sort of locations, because the lakes is similar, the challenge is one of discovery. Discovering the hotels, discovering what you can do, discovering how to do what you want to do. I would recommend you probably need a car. I think you can do a decent Canadian Rockies holiday without a car. You know, booking excursions, using some of the services that get you along the Icefield Parkway. But I think some of the magic would be lost. Now, I don't normally drive on holiday, and I've chosen to drive in the Canadian Rockies. That's how much I think you need a car to get the sense of adventure and wonder from this. Certainly don't be afraid to go all 90s and get a Lonely Planet guide. There is nothing wrong with that, and it makes perfect sense in this situation. If you've got any questions, certainly don't hesitate to ask. I will help where I can, having booked my first trip to the Canadian Rockies. But I would also advise you to look at TripAdvisors. There are some really expert people on there who go year after year, who've done numerous trips, who are amazingly and practically helpful. They have been absolutely amazing as a community of people. Thank you for listening. You can subscribe right now by clicking the link to the left. You can watch the rest of these Rockies Ready videos by clicking the link to the top right, and also my last holiday in Florida to the bottom right. Until next time.